Hi, good morning. My name's Rebecca Jackson, and this is another workshop for the Speak Their Name Suicide Memorial Quilt. Thanks for tuning in and watching me today, and I hope you get something from this workshop. Today I'm going to take a bit of a break from difficult sewing and stitching techniques and give you some ideas of some projects that you can do that involve colouring in and cutting out. So something for everybody, and again something that you can get the children working on as well while they're bored and in lockdown. So the topic I want to talk to you about today is storytelling and the concept of identity. And I'm going to show you some things today. If you're bored and want to do some Amazon shopping, I've got some great ideas for you. One of the big inspirations for me whilst doing this quilt has been this book, which is called Threads of Life by Claire Hunter, who is a Scottish textile artist. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's a really, really good read. And Claire has been looking at all the different techniques of storytelling and how needlework and crafting has been used from the dawn of time for, in the main, women to tell their story via stitching. And one of the stories that really resonated with me was a story about some Australian women during the Second World War who were held captive in a prisoner of war camp in Japan. And they had nothing available to them, and if they were caught doing anything at all subversive, they could have lost their lives and put everybody else's life in jeopardy. And what they did, using anything that was available to them, is they made a quilt, and they made it from scraps of fabric from their dresses, and they were stitched together by unravelling the threads that held their clothes together and used those threads to sew this quilt. And the purpose of the quilt was to tell their story. And the reason they wanted to tell their story was these women didn't know whether they'd ever leave the prisoner of war camp and whether they'd survive their ordeal. So the purpose of the quilt was to identify them should they die whilst they were held captive. So each square told a little bit about themselves that would identify them to those that came afterwards. And that got me thinking a lot about our Speak Their Name memorial quilt. And the concept of the name Speak Their Name came about because so often when you lose your loved one to suicide, people don't like mentioning, in my case, their child's name, because they didn't want to have that difficult conversation, or they thought it would upset you. But for us as bereaved family members and friends, it's not upsetting. We don't want that name to ever be forgotten. So the concept behind each square you make is to cling on to and hold on to that identity. So I suppose what I'm saying is the whole concept behind the quilt is to hold on to the identity of the people we're making that square for. So a few of you have asked in the Facebook group about lettering and words and telling stories through that medium, and we're not all great stitchers. I am not the world's greatest embroiderer, so I was thinking of other ways of putting words onto paper, words onto fabric, that didn't necessarily involve complicated embroidery. So we've got some things here. You can get these online and they're absolutely fabulous. These are called Posca pens. I don't know if you can see that. And they come in different nibs, so you can get chiselled nibs for calligraphy, you can get very fine nibs, and this is a medium one. And the Posca pens are full of very intense paint. So if you can see here, let's hope this works. So even on a very dark blue background, you can see that ink comes up very, it's really easy to see. They come in all different sorts of colours. So if you use it on a slightly lighter surface, you can see they really are quite eye-catching. And I think they're about £2 or £3 each, and you can buy them in sets. So if you wanted to use something for lettering, these are a great idea. And something I've done with that, which is something that anybody can do, I've just done a square here, and with a Posca pen I've just written some stuff that reminds me of Elspeth, and that's something that anybody can do. You don't need any stitching skills whatsoever. You can just draw on your square. The other thing that I've used, and you can see here some teeth marks in this. My dog has had a go at this book, and this is using just books, magazines. Books are better than a magazine because it hasn't got a glossy surface. So what you can do with paper is you can just cut words out and you can stick them on fabric. Now what you don't want to happen is, if you're going to use this for your final piece, is you don't want this fabric to your words or your paper to fall off the fabric as the paint dries. So what I've done is, you can tear a piece off, and this is just PVA glue. I'm just going to pour some in here. This is just normal PVA glue that you can get from a craft shop. Your kids have probably got some. And put some glue on the back, stick it where you want it to go, and then it's almost like a decoupage technique. Put a thick coating. It might look really thick and blobby. But when it dries, that will put a really secure coating on it, and it will dry clear, and it won't look damp, but it will hold that piece of paper securely to your fabric, and you can actually stitch over that as well. So to give you an idea of something I've done with that, I've just taken just a piece of cotton fabric, and I've cut out some words that are personal to me and remind me of Elspeth, and I've stuck them on the fabric. I've coated it with PVA glue, and I've stitched with just some running stitch, stitched the fabric onto, I've layered it onto some darker fabric, and I've frayed round the edge. And that's a really simple idea for a square. And as I say, you need no creative or embroidery skills whatsoever to do that. You can also use the paper as a background piece, and I've just coloured a rainbow on in watercolour pencils. And again, you can glue that onto a piece of background fabric, and you can just stick that on there, and you can add things to it to make a collage. Another thing that works well if you're doing different paper techniques is using acrylic paints. So this ooh, which I can't get the lid off, is some white acrylic. And again, what you can do with this, if you get a piece of paper, is just roughly paint the acrylic over the words. And it makes it slightly opaque, and it just gives an interesting background, and then you can use that as a background piece to make collage with. So to give you an idea of how that works, here I've done some layering. So it's scraps of fabric, and again on this fabric I've used some acrylic paint over the top and a piece of acrylic painted paper which I've glued. I've taken some flowers from a plant catalogue and some bits of paper from a magazine. I've painted it all over with white acrylic. I've glued it to the fabric, and I've layered the fabric and just stitched it on with some normal sewing cotton. And going back to the embroidery that we did last week, this is just some lettering. It's one of my favourite Dylan Thomas poems, and I've written that in pencil, and then I've gone over it in little tiny back stitches, which are probably the best stitch for doing lettering with. And all of a sudden it's really simple. It doesn't take long to do, but just have a play about, get some scraps of fabric, get some bits of paper out of a magazine, out of an old paperback, rip it up, experiment with some paints, and it makes quite an effective square. All I'm doing today really is giving you some ideas for things you can do at home with bits and pieces you might have lying about. Again, with the collage technique, if you want to be a bit more daring, this is another layering piece, and people say, well, I don't know what to do, I haven't got any fabric lying about the house. These are tiny scraps of fabric that I've layered to make a bigger piece, and I've just stitched them together. I've done an embroidered tree, which is just the whip stitch, which was in the previous video, and French knots. And again, the wording is just done with back stitch. If you are really uncreative at all, I've got, actually this isn't the right one, but this is just an ink pad for scrapbooking or stamping. It's just felt dye ink, and all I did was cover my entire hand with it, which wasn't a great idea because it took me a whole afternoon to wash it all off again. But I've just done a handprint, and it's really simple, it's really straightforward, and you can use the handprint as it is. You can put a number of handprints on there. You can embroider over the top. You could stick pieces of paper on top of that, so it's almost like somebody holding a rainbow in their hand. You could do a bit of embroidery on it as well. But it's just using what you have lying about the house to create something, thinking a little bit outside the box. Although this is quilting, it isn't necessarily about being a great and intricate stitcher. You can really let your imagination run riot. Talking about scraps of fabric that you might have about the house, this one is just a pocket off a pair of jeans. Sometimes you might have a photograph or a letter or something that you wanted to keep but you didn't want to sew it on a background. So this is a pocket from a pair of jeans, and whenever my daughter went out I would always give her a £5 so she could ring me or she could get a taxi home if she needed to. So I've just popped a £5 note in there. You could put a letter, you could put a photograph, you could put a concert ticket, you could put a postcard, you could put whatever you want in the back of that, and just stitch that onto your background piece. So, I don't know if you can hear my dogs howling in the background. I've decided they want to be out in the sunshine. So there's lots of ideas there. You can use embroidery, you can use paints. If you want inspiration, there are loads of books on fibre art and using collage and stitching and paints. This book is Stitch Stories by a textile artist called Cass Holmes, and you can see in here, oops. This is a patchwork quilt she's made about the First World War, and she's used loads of different fabrics. She's used pieces out of books, she's used photographs from magazines, she's glued them, she's layered them with stitching, she's used an old handkerchief, and she's embroidered flowers and things over the top. Here's something else she's used using a handkerchief, and she uses things like tea and tea bags to dye and stain her fabric, and then embroiders over the top with free motion embroidery. If you're looking for inspiration, Cass Holmes has written quite a lot of books on textile art, and they're all available on Amazon. And she's also got YouTube channels where she talks about some of her exhibition work and some of the techniques she uses. So if you're at a loose end this week and you're fed up of watching Midsummer Murders, you might want to check out some of Cass Holmes' YouTube videos. And another book I've been looking at recently is Leanne Prain, another textile artist, who this book talks a lot about storytelling and identity through stitching. And this is a quilt that a man had made after his wife died using her old clothes. And as you can see here, it doesn't have to be difficult pieced square patchwork. This is just made in a random way, and hearts and different things have been embroidered over the top of it. So I hope that's given you some ideas this week to have a go at and have a play. And the emphasis really is about no rules quilting. This doesn't have to be fancy stitching. Get your paints out, stain some fabric with tea bags or some cold coffee or children's paints, watercolours, felt tip pens. Use whatever you've got. Have a play about and think about identity and storytelling, because this is your story and only you can tell it. So do what works for you and what is appropriate for you. And if you've got any ideas or any techniques you'd like to try out, please join us on the Facebook page. Speak Their Name, Greater Manchester Suicide Memorial Quilt. Come and join in. And I'd love to see what you're doing, and I will check in with you again next week. So thanks very much. Bye bye now.